series. I co-host this webinar series with Elise Chotard. Elise is a comms expert and I'm a researcher, and we have a common interest in ethical practices in photography and development research. So today we're going to talk about fieldwork in the Global South, and we're going to cover issues relevant to both researchers and practitioners, for people working across cultures or within their own culture, anywhere there are power imbalances that need navigating for ethical practice. So today I'm joined by two speakers, my colleague Laura Picot and Chris Millora, who are both experts in the area of ethical practice in fieldwork in the Global South. So Laura is a PhD DPhil student in the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. And she wrote
Catherine, you've just gone on mute.
Sorry. Oh, thank you for that. No problem. I'll start again. Laura is a DPhil student at the University of Oxford, and she researches how Ghanaian farmers' gender and intersectional identities shape their climate resilience. She is committed to improving equity in research and academia, and has developed a code of conduct for ethical and anti-racist fieldwork. So Laura, how are you doing today? And it looks like you're joining us from the department, are you, in Oxford?
I am indeed. This isn't my office, so don't judge the selection of books behind me. But I am lucky enough to be working in the School of Geography and Environment in Oxford today.
Fantastic, wonderful. It's great to have you. And let me introduce Chris Millora, who is a research associate at the School of Education and Lifelong Learning at the University of East Anglia. And he's recently passed his PhD viva, and is finalising the corrections for a PhD in Education and International Development from the University of East Anglia. So Chris is interested on issues of positionality when researching back home, and the ethics of reciprocity in conducting long-term fieldwork in the Global South. So Chris, where in the world are you joining us from today, and what time?
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm joining you from Iloilo City in the Philippines, where it's 8 o'clock in the evening. So good evening, everybody.
Wow, that's so late. Thank you so much for joining us today. So for anyone who's attended one of our events before, you know that we always pre-record the conversation to avoid any connection issues on the day. So I'm going to play the video shortly, and then we're going to go into the live Q&A. So please do post your questions in the chat as they come to you. You don't need to wait until the video is finished playing to type your questions in. So do get in quickly with any burning questions as they arise. Thank you so much everyone for joining, and I really hope that you enjoy the conversation. So thank you both so much for joining me today. I was wondering if we could start off with you telling me a bit about your fieldwork experiences, and particularly how you became interested in fieldwork ethics.
Sure. Well, so I am in the School of Geography and came in effectively as an outsider, having done an undergraduate degree in biology, where we did fieldwork, but it was a very different kind of fieldwork. And for example, I did a field trip as an undergrad to South Africa, and there was no consideration of how we were interacting with our South African colleagues. And now I do research on Ghana, and I was pretty surprised that I'm not Ghanaian, I don't have any family or cultural ties to the country. And suddenly I was going to be allowed to go by myself to Ghana for the first time and collect data. And there were no discussions really about the ethics of that. And I was seeking training. I did a little bit from what I could find, but then I effectively went cold and did this fieldwork and came across inevitable challenges and things that I wasn't that prepared for, but had been trying to prepare myself for. And I actually ended up just doing a short scoping trip, and then I was supposed to go back last year and do a longer stint of fieldwork to collect the bulk of my data collection, and then COVID hit. And what I'm now doing is working with a team of Ghanaian researchers remotely. So I'm in the UK and they're in Ghana, and helping them, training them, managing them while they collect data and work on this project as well. And that's also really sparked my interest in thinking about ethics of fieldwork, because it's one thing being these fieldwork contexts yourself and working with communities and living with communities and all the dynamics that come with that. And it's another thing to work with teams and researchers and think also about what the ethics of that is, and particularly when effectively you're in a management position and it's your role to look after the well-being of people, the welfare of people, have a say in their careers and what work you're trying to get them to do, and asking, you know, what you're asking them to do on a project. There's a lot of ethics around that, which I found challenging at the beginning, and it's been a process to sort of figure it out. And I think generally I'm really interested in academia, and as academics, it's not just important what we do, the work that we do, but also how we do it. And that's actually become a major part of my PhD thesis now, about thinking about how can we decolonize research methods, particularly when we're using fieldwork methods and working with field teams.
Yeah, really interesting. Absolutely fascinating fieldwork journey there from undergrad to DPhil level. What about you, Chris?
Thanks so much for having me. Laura, I kind of identify with some of the things you're saying. In fact, I did my master's dissertation at UCL, and I only did online interviews. And I felt that it didn't feel like real research. And so I promised myself during my PhD that, you know, I'm going to go to the field and then I'm going to conduct research in the field, because then that's actual firsthand research. Of course, I was very naive then. But in terms of my fieldwork experiences, I did it in the Philippines, in Iloilo City. It's the city where I grew up, where I lived, and then where I worked for many years. And it's ethnographic fieldwork that looks at the learning and literacy dimension of so-called vulnerable youths and adults. So within volunteering research, just to give you a bit of a context, in volunteering research, there's this dominant notion that a volunteer is a middle-class, middle-aged person who has extra time and money to help the poor. So the poor is always the person who receives. And the reason why I want to do my fieldwork is to challenge through ethnographic research this kind of dominant understanding and say, well, actually, there's a lot of helping that's already existing within poorer communities, the poor helping his or her fellow poor. So that's reason why, and that's the kind of the rationale behind I want the conduct of the ethnographic research. But in terms of fieldwork ethics, like many other PhD students, I was, this is my first time conducting fieldwork, and ethnographic fieldwork. So like many other PhD students, I did an extensive ethical application process to start the fieldwork in my institution. And it occurred to me really quickly, even before I went to the field, that it was much more messier, that a lot of these issues that you have to deal with are very ad hoc, they're a lot messier, they're a lot complicated. But I think that the ethical approval process, although it provided some very useful starting points for me to think about, it was very limiting when I tried to kind of deal with them one by one. So, and I've always been thinking about that. How do we go beyond the institutional ethical procedures or the bare minimum of what ethical practice is, and how can we create ethical relationships in the field? And that's where the interest came from.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks.
That's so interesting.
Go on.
I was going to say it's so interesting because I feel like, here that Oxford, the ethics approval process almost feels a bit sort of clinical, and like it really doesn't anticipate well at all the ad hoc situations that you were talking about. And then I found I gone through the ethics approval process, had conversations with my supervisors, and then I found myself having to deal with issues when I was doing my fieldwork, and I felt almost like, oh no, is this my fault because I've done my ethics approval, so like surely everything should go perfectly. And then you come across challenges, and then it's almost like this sort of clinical form-filling thing that actually in some ways goes out the window a little bit, or things like getting consent. And how do you get consent when, I don't know, you're like just meet someone on the street, or there's like people walk into your focus group because you're doing it in the like village square, and then like random people turn up and start talking, and you're like, wait, you haven't signed my form, but I want to write down what you're saying because it's so interesting.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, and I guess the thing is that these ethical issues, there are so many, it's potentially an enormous topic. So in terms of ethical issues that you think might need more attention or need more engagement with beyond these sort of formal ethical procedures, what do you think those main issues are and why?
Who do you want to go first? Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I was just writing down actually while you were talking, Laura, this issue of informed consent, because I think that's one of the spaces within ethical, ethical processes and the way people have written about ethical practice. There is still that understanding that written consent is the gold standard of informed consent, which I think has been challenged by many ethnographers, but also many in our field, comparative education researchers, that there are some kind of power relations in signing something, right, in many communities. And then the other narrative around that is they say that informed consent should be a constant seeking of permission. And I kind of thought about that a lot during my field work, that every time, I see someone or we conduct an activity with the volunteers, I have to ask for consent all the time, because it changes, etc. But what I realized, even in that kind of relationship where you have to constantly seek permission, is that the community members felt as if I was so different. So they told me this: why do you feel as if you're so different from us? Why do you keep on asking us these questions when we already told you yes? So even as I was intending to make that as a way for us to get closer, show them respect, show them empathy, etc., it was actually kind of pushing us away from each other because it's an additional barrier to the communication. So how do you navigate around these ways of working, particularly in consent? That's one. And I think the other thing, and this is much more closer to what I write about, is this issue of reciprocity, especially in PhD research. I think there's just, I don't know if you agree with me, Laura, and also Catherine, but I feel like sometimes there's this imbalance of benefit, and there's a tendency for research, particularly long-term ethnographic fieldwork in vulnerable, quote-unquote, communities, to be very extractive. And when you look at the ethical procedures, it just tells you, we hope that you enjoy the process of talking to me. When you write that, don't have any benefits from the research, and then it says, well, I hope you enjoy talking to me. So can we go beyond just enjoyment? And I've been thinking a lot about that. Number one, what you can do about it, whether it is at all possible to kind of narrow down that imbalance, because at the end of the day, I got my PhD, right? And then the community are still doing what they, as what's happening to them ever since I was doing the fieldwork. The power imbalance, the inequalities, they're still existing.
Yeah, definitely. And even though you say it's not directly fieldwork related, fieldwork doesn't end when we leave the field. So it is intrinsically fieldwork related, especially when you're talking about telling people's stories and the stories of those people that you've met in the field.
Exactly. Yeah,
Chris, there's so much I want to respond to there, and I actually really agree with what you've said. I think with the informed consent, I think often it almost feels like we've borrowed from this process from, for example, countries like the UK, where we have to have audit trails and everything has to be on paper, so that if something goes wrong, you can essentially cover your back and you're like, oh, well, I didn't do anything wrong because I have a signature that says that they agree to this. But trying to transfer that model to circumstances where, for example, people are illiterate, you're going to, people are understandably like, I don't want to sign this when I can't read it, or it's written in a different language, or their only experiences of having to sign documentation in the past have led to them being stripped of rights. It's highly inappropriate, and we are, it's good that we're having these conversations about what alternative forms of consent look like and how we can establish that, and how we can ground the process of making sure people are okay with being involved and are fully informed within the culture of what's appropriate. And what I'm consistently being fed back at the moment with the communities I'm working with in Ghana is some communities have not really ever come across researchers, but the communities that have come across researchers, it's a bit like, oh, okay, another group of researchers, fine, we're happy to talk to you, we're happy to be involved in this study. But every single time we do this, we never hear from researchers again. And that's Ghanaian researchers and researchers from other countries. And you know, there's a lot you can do within the moment of collecting data to make sure people's time is fairly valued. And, you know, for example, whether you should provide people lunch, or whether you should pay for travel, or whether you should give gifts or give things to children, etc. I mean, that's one thing in the moment. But the longer term thing is what the people who are involved in my studies are really consistently coming back and saying to me. It's like, please just don't, whatever you do, just don't be another one of these researchers who comes and collects data and promises the world and says that you're going to change our lives. And we never hear from you again. And then sort of the last thing I'd raise is that because I work closely with these teams, I think a lot about the ethics of how we interact with research assistants or field assistants or field researchers, or however you want to. I'm not a big fan of calling them assistants. And how do we appropriately recognise their input and their voice, and particularly within the traditional academic framework of who gets to be a co-author and what counts as a significant contribution of research, and how do you recognise those contributions fairly in ways that are meaningful to them, and what kind of work are they being asked to do, and is that appropriate to their skill level, and are we essentially asking them to do drudge work that we wouldn't want to do ourselves, etc. So I think there's a lot I could say there about working with field teams, but I think I was very conscious that wasn't particularly covered in institutional ethics processes that I had to undertake before fieldwork.
Yeah, really interesting points. What I was thinking about was this trying to feedback research findings, and in a way that's sort of it has very different questions in the global north and the global south, right? Because in the global north you would perhaps send out a report or put it online or send it out by email, whereas in the global south, in some of the communities some communities I've worked in Ethiopia, very rural areas, you would actually actively have to travel to that place to feedback the research findings. So it's like it needs funding and it needs time, and so there needs to be that enabling environment institutionally to allow for that, which sort of brings me on to the next question, really. Chris, you published this paper in 2020 on reflecting on ethics of PhD research in the global south, particularly looking at reciprocity, reflexivity, excuse me, and situatedness. And yeah, so I just started thinking about how there are these very specific ethical issues for doing fieldwork in the global south. So can you tell us a bit more about what inspired this work and what you think are the main takeaway messages?
What really inspired me and my two other colleagues in writing this paper is that we felt that there was this disconnect. Again, we talked about this a lot, right? By those ethical procedures required by our institutions and this more situated ethics, but at the same time, the limitations of the tools that we're being asked to use to be able to deal with some of these issues. So I remember, and I remember how we were so confused and so bothered that there are certain things that we are critiquing that we are actually part of or we're contributing because of our research. So I remember I was telling my colleagues when we were writing that I met these government officials in the Philippines, similar like you, Laura. They were saying, well, scientists come to our city and then, we conduct hours and hours in interview and then they get some funding. We see it on Facebook, but we never know about it. We never know if you're part of that funding, etc. I don't know what's happening there. So they said that made us feel very uncomfortable. And I said, oh, no, I'm never going to do that with my research. And then when I started doing this long-term fieldwork in the Philippines, I kind of realized, oh my God, maybe I'm doing exactly the same thing. It feels like, exactly what you're saying, Laura. What are the limitations of a PhD research that's very time-bounded and that's being tied to very institutional, bureaucratic, ethical procedures? What are some of the limitations that we're facing? So this is the question that animated this particular paper. And the tools that were given by literature and some of the ethical, procedures that we have, and how much of them could sometimes be very limiting. So, for example, we talk in the paper. We talk about reflexivity, almost like a silver bullet that framed like a silver bullet to yeah, deal with some of these ethical issues. Well, do you have a problem with positionality? Just reflect about it, and then maybe in the process of reflecting, you find solutions. I mean, reflection is really important, but it's almost always framed as an individual activity. And so with our experience, we're trying to argue that actually reflection could be a group experience. It could be a partnership. It could be a collaboration. You can reflect with another person. You can reflect with your participants in some of the dilemmas that you have. So maybe some of these questions like, how do I give back? This does not have to be your question alone. This could be something that you can discuss with the participants you've worked with, and then maybe they have better solutions, for instance. So sometimes there could be a sense of paralysis when you just reflect, and then there's very limited actions you can do. But I think the very key takeaway that we're trying to propose here is to think of research as almost like a life project. And this is a concept that one of my colleagues has taught me, actually. That is, in thinking of your research not as a limited time period, exactly what you said, Catherine, like a limited time for data collection, but can we think of research as only part of a series of activities, or this fieldwork as a series of relational activities that we do with this community? For example, I'm wondering why a lot of researchers think that the only kind of relationships you can get in doing fieldwork, when you do your fieldwork, are research related. For sure, you've experienced this. So many other relationships, they become your friends, they become your colleagues, they give you very good ideas in the process. This is not just a research relationship. That's why when I think about the issue of writing up, when I write about the people I research, then sometimes my arbiter is, well, they've become my friends. Do I really want them? Do I really want people to read about them like this? Because the kind of relationship I developed in the process of fieldwork is not only research related, it's much more than that. So going beyond fieldwork, going beyond a limited amount of data collection, and going beyond research relationships, but also thinking that that period of research is not only the product of that, is not only the thesis. My supervisor told me this when I was when I felt really bad about kind of these issues of reciprocity. She was telling me, that your research, only one product of that is the thesis. There's so many other products you could write about. You can write about a policy brief, for example. You have connections in the Philippines. She's telling me, why don't you write a policy brief for the policymakers that can, take better account, how are you going to frame some of these data so that it's accessible to other audiences? So then you could have a different kind of purpose, right? So I think it's about expanding what we feel we can do with the kind of data that we've received or that we've collected in the process of fieldwork. And this is what we're really trying to propose in this paper. So think of your research as life project and the relationships that are enduring. You could come back later. I've come back to my fieldwork, but not as a researcher anymore. I didn't go there to research, just eat with them and then just have fun. I mean, it's something that we do as well, right? It's not very structured and things like that. So it's the continuing relationship, perhaps all throughout my life, because I'm going to do another research that it's involved that's involving them. So I think there's so much else we can do other than just research with these communities.
I totally agree with that framing, Chris. And I think we think about research, and particularly when we do fieldwork, we're living there, right? Regardless if you're there for a week or for a year, you're spending time, you stay with people, you're living in these communities, and the time you actually spend, asking your questions or whatever, so in my example, it's such a small part of your experience. Doing follow-up trips that aren't necessarily collecting data, but you're more there giving back to the community or just spending time with people. Yeah. All of these things are super important. But when we're working on tight timelines and tight budgets, exactly, they get dropped by the wayside. And that's a problem. And that I would love to see a shift. And I'm, Catherine and I are sort of trying to lobby internally for a shift towards valuing those things.
Yeah, I mean, the time is limited. So just thinking about we're PhD students, right? I did my fieldwork in the context of my PhD. And then I would even say that would give you a bit more time to actually have that kind of relationship. Of course, it's still very limited because I was supposed to finish in 3 years and then I don't have funding after the 3rd year, so I have to, deal with my own for a year, right? And so that has been challenging in terms of that kind of limitations. But I also think about other academics who don't even have time to do research. I mean, of course, they research in a certain way where you can't even go to the community and spend some more time there. So there are a lot of limits to it. And you're right, a lot of it is structural, and how the academia is being shaped and how academia is being formatted and structured within the UK. That kind of brings a lot of these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you were saying, Chris, about going beyond reflexivity towards action and sort of kind of finding these solutions, which is really interesting, because that's what Laura and I have been trying to do, really, in developing, we're developing a code of conduct for ethical and anti-racist fieldwork practices, which has been commissioned by the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. So Laura, you've done nearly all the work on this. A huge amount of work, and it's been a long process. I was wondering, can you tell us a bit more about it, what gap it's filling and why it's so important?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, it touches on a lot of the themes that we've talked about so far, and where we started was we were thinking about all these other sort of softer or grey area ethical issues that sit alongside existing university or institutional ethics processes. And I did a thorough review of, I've already had to do it for my fieldwork, but I went back and looked through what are researchers required to ethically think about before they go and do fieldwork. And there was a huge remit of stuff that isn't covered in existing risk processes or ethics processes. And also in our university, you only have to do, if you're going to go and do fieldwork, you only have to do an ethics form if you have human participants in your research. So if you're interviewing people or doing ethnographic research, things like that. But if you're, for example, an ecologist who works, in sub-Saharan Africa with communities on big cats, or my housemate does research in Kyrgyzstan on earthquakes and spends time with communities there, they don't have to do an ethics form at all. And ethics goes so much beyond what is the direct relationship between you and the participants in your research. And we wanted to address all of the things that essentially arise from your inherent presence in the field, whether you're a natural scientist or a social scientist, regardless of the geography. And we wanted to create a broad, easy to use guide and tool that encouraged people to, again, be reflexive, to think about these things, but not just themselves, but something that they could use to have conversations with their colleagues, with their supervisors, and particularly with people who they're working with in these fieldwork contexts, and with communities that they're working with, and with participants. And so what we've come up with is a broad set of principles and questions that are designed to be adapted to one's specific fieldwork context. And it addresses things like what we were saying about, how do you navigate boundaries between being a quote impartial researcher, not that we ever are, and a friend. What do we do if we're working with communities and there's people in need and people ask for us for help? And how do we fairly reward our colleagues and our field teams for their contributions? What do you do if someone, a very kind community member, has a sort of attached themselves to your project and you're not hiring them, but they're being very helpful, and you sort of actually really rely on them, but you've not, they're not officially like writing down numbers for you or anything? And then these longer term things, and Chris, it speaks to what you were saying earlier about how do we represent people. It covers a lot, and we've tried to make it in very easily accessible language without toning it down. And also these sorts of things, particularly, terms like anti-racist, are inherently fairly politically charged. And there's, I know so many field workers, in fact, the vast majority of people who I know do field work really care about these things and think about them a lot. And but we're also conscious that there's perhaps some people who don't think about this as much as they could, and who might be turned off by language that's too political. So it's been an interesting thing trying to remain ambitious, remain relevant, but broad enough to speak to a really broad range of people doing lots of different types of work in lots of different contexts. And producing the guide in a really collaborative sense and getting input from the voices that need to be heard and the voices that really matter when we think about how we treat people and the ethics of that.
So I was wondering if you can share your experiences of reflecting on your positionality and why it's been so important for you to use that in your work and the way that you act when you're doing field work.
Yeah, yeah, I can start. I mean, I think I think a lot about this this particular issue. In fact, prior to coming to my field work, that was a couple of years ago, I told myself that I'm such a huge advantage because I'm researching home. I know the language. I know how to talk to people here. I know where the places are. I don't have to, insurance. Yeah, it's good, but I know how to keep myself safe in this particular space. So a lot of it was already kind of in the bag, more or less, because I am familiar with the city. However, for me, it has always been limiting to think of this insider outsider dichotomy. And I think a lot of people have challenged that in the past in their writing across many different disciplines. And I definitely agree that, for me, my experience, even if I'm doing my research in the city here, in the city, I can tell you that I've also struggled so much around certain understandings of how things are done here or the culture here. So, for example, my research was with an urban poor community. One of the field work I've done was when this urban poor community, I've worked with them for about a year. They were evicted from their piece of land. I was also evicted from the land where we lived in. That was a couple of years back. And so I should understand what they're going through. But actually, no, not really. It's so different. And even if I speak the language, I work with LGBTQIA plus community here, working on HIV/AIDS awareness, volunteering in that area. And I remember, and this is literally about language. I know how to speak the language here, but there's a gay language. There's this language that they use, and it's a different kind of way of talking, different words that they're using that I have to get accustomed with. And then the other point I'd like to raise here, and I think this is something you've already said, Laura, is that a lot of this is about positioning ourselves in the community, but we need to realize that the community is also positioning us as certain kinds of people when we enter their kind of community and their field. And we need to be very, very careful about how this happens. Of course, a lot of this is invisible.
Yeah, there's so much that I agree with. Thanks, Chris. I think ultimately it's about people, isn't it? It's about, we form relationships with people, we interact with people. It's no different to how we interact with people in our day-to-day lives when we're not doing field work. And also, I think how we position ourselves is, or certainly I found that my position, I feel it shift depending on who I'm with when I'm doing field work. So in many senses, I'm seen often as, if I'm working, if I'm in these pretty poor rural communities in Ghana where they're mostly cocoa farmers, and I come in and I'm immediately recognizable as the white person, the Abruni, even though I don't identify as white, I identify as mixed race. And I am, I get introduced as a researcher from the UK, and it's like, oh, you're from the UK, and I'm acutely conscious of the kind of former colonizer dynamic and all of this that comes with it. But then there's also this thing of like, oh, okay, well, I'm also a young woman and I'm not married. And what does it mean that I'm not married? And people proposition me, or people are like, why aren't you married? Why don't you have children? And in many ways, these are just questions that people are asking you to get to know you, because you're coming in as an alien, right? You're someone who isn't from that community, and people are really just trying to figure you out and figure out what your place is in all of this and where you kind of fit within the social structures that are familiar to them. You're often not the most informed person there, or rarely even are you the most informed person. And to recognize that and to reflect on your own position, and I think there's a lot about approaching research with a sense of humility and openness and candor, and just willing to be like, I'm here to learn, I want to treat people well, and also to go into the field in advance with some awareness of how you might be seen. So I made sure that I knew before I was going. I spoke to other people, other women who had gone and done research in Ghana, and was like, what was it like? What did you get asked? How was your experience? What did you do to position yourself? What did you do to make sure that when you are entering these communities, you're navigating things as culturally appropriately as possible? How are you deferring to people when they should be deferred to? How are you greeting people? How are you using the correct terminology for people and addressing people? All of this stuff. And almost in advance, anticipating how you might position yourself within that community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think humility is one of the most important characteristics we can have as field workers. So thank you so much for talking about that, Laura. So we've just got 1 or 2 minutes left, and I just want to ask you a final question. So to someone in the audience who may be going to do fieldwork in the Global South for the first time, what do you wish that you'd known before you started, and what one piece of advice would you give them? Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure, I think it's a good question. I think lots of things, but I think I wish I had known and truly believed that things would not go to plan, and that there would be many times when I had to make judgment calls which I hadn't anticipated, and that's not your fault. That's just how it goes. You know, we're dealing with people are complicated, and I think it's important as a field worker to give yourself some grace and to try your best and to set things up in advance such that, you know, you can schedule breaks for yourself and realize that so often, you know, we're tired, we've had a long day, we're worried about our work, we're worried about not getting the data, we're worried about whether we're, you know, our flight home is booked and we're not going to finish all of these things. So what can you do to look after yourself so that you set up support networks and check-ins or whatever with folks back home or people who can look after you, and to expect that there will be times when you're uncomfortable and when things go wrong and when you make mistakes, and that doesn't make you a worse researcher, and that doesn't mean that you're behaving, your intentions are unethical. It's just par for the course, and there's things you can do to mitigate that. But fieldwork is, the kind of beauty of fieldwork is that you don't really know what's going to happen. And when it doesn't happen as you expected, you kind of got to roll with it. And that's incredible, but it's also very taxing. And be kind to yourself in that process.
Thanks, Laura. Fantastic advice. And what about you, Chris?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna echo what Laura was saying, that fieldwork is a fantastic time. And for me, it could be a really exciting moment. And I know that a lot of you, or a lot of us, actually go to the field with sort of preliminary research questions and some of these frameworks for data collection, wishing that it would all go according to plan. But, you know, I urge you to really open up a little bit, you know, talk to people as part of your research or not, you know, see what's important to them, try and understand the community. Because I think we have gone to say in our conversation so far, we have gone on and to say that ethics is complicated. It's different according to different communities. You know, you have to decide on a case-to-case basis. But actually, in my experience, what helped me a lot in making these decisions was my understanding of the community and the kinds of relationships that I've developed in the process. So when I'm faced with a dilemma sometimes, actually often most of the time, when I'm faced with a dilemma, I ask myself, what would a community member do? I put myself in the position of a community member, then take my decision from there. And then again, just to reiterate what I said earlier, and that's part of the core message of our paper, I suggest that you go ahead and, you know, think beyond fieldwork as a discrete stage of data collection, that the relationships you are creating are only research relationships, and the only product that you can get from the research is a thesis. There's still plenty of other spaces and places that your fieldwork can take you. So that's what makes it exciting.
Great, thanks, Chris. Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us, Catherine.
Wonderful, great conversation. I absolutely loved recording that, and I'm really excited to continue the conversation now. So I've noticed that there aren't any questions in the chat box yet, so please do type your questions, get typing and send them in. So I'm going to start with one, which is actually it's quite a taboo subject actually. We don't often talk about it, but I think it's really important to shine light on it. And when I was listening to the conversation, and Chris, you were talking about fieldwork as a relational experience and how important it is to have relationships beyond the researcher-participant relationship. And then Laura as well, your comment about how fieldwork is all about people. And I think that's so, so critical. But then also it's a very fine line to tread between relationships that are and are not appropriate. So I'm thinking particularly about sexual relationships where there's a huge power imbalance between the researcher or people in the community, or and then also thinking about the cultural acceptability of alcohol and drugs. So in one of my field sites in Ethiopia, it was very common to chew chat, which is a narcotic leaf. And it would be sort of culturally expected to participate in those kind of rituals. Or when you're interviewing someone and they're drinking alcohol, whether you should engage in drinking alcohol or not. I think this is something that I've been reflecting on a lot myself, and I feel like it's something we don't really talk about very much. And I just wondered if any of you had any comments on that, either of you.
I mean, I don't, as Catherine and I have talked about this a bit, and I think it's a really difficult one. And I think the first thing I'd say is I really agree that this comes up so often, and it's a real taboo subject within academia, and that's a massive problem in and of itself, that this should be addressed and people should be expecting this before they go and do fieldwork, and that there should be an open acknowledgement that this happens, because at the moment it's this sort of hidden thing, and then you're in these situations and fairly clueless about what the right thing is. I think firstly, I would encourage researchers to not do anything that makes you uncomfortable. So, and it's kind of an initial principle of, okay, well, ethically, what's the right thing to do here? If it's going to make you uncomfortable to, for example, participate in drinking rituals, or if it's going to put you in an unsafe situation. For example, I've heard of female researchers being in contexts where they've been the only woman and there've been groups of men who are drinking heavily around them. You don't have to stay in that situation. And I would encourage researchers to, think about your own well-being. And I mean, my personal view is that there is not necessarily a blanket rule that's applicable here about what is right and wrong. My research talks a lot about gender and intersectionality, and we talked before in the earlier conversation about positioning ourselves. And it is really important when you are entering any relationship, whether that's a friendship, a romantic relationship, a sexual relationship, that you consider what your positionality is and your own intersections, and that includes things like your gender, your sexual orientation, your how you're perceived. And also, if you are going to enter any kind of relationship, really thinking ahead of time or as you're engaging with it about what the expectations are, and to make sure that the mutual expectations are there and no one's misleading anyone, and that it's not the case, for example, that people expect if you engage in certain relationships, then you're going to provide them certain things if you can't provide those. So that doesn't really give an answer in terms of like there's a right and a wrong, because I think it massively depends on the context.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
What about Chris? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, so putting boundaries is really important, I think, just like what Lara was saying, but also I did not have this, I mean, I agree that there's no blanket rule. So let me approach that question by telling you my experience, what I have experienced that might be slightly related to that and what I did in the process. So in working with some of my, with the volunteers, I was asked to join a certain scheme that, I mean, I couldn't go to any detail in this, but it was a scheme and I felt really uncomfortable in being part of it and in being party to this, particular scheme that they were doing. And so what I did actually was, rather than closing myself immediately, what I did was kind of be very honest with it. So I tried to tell them what my feelings are. And this particular approach I found was really useful in making myself visible and making my own boundaries visible, because at some point they actually respected it. They knew that I wouldn't do certain things because I was honest at some point that I have limitations. So making these things visible, I think, is also really important. And having that, part of having that relationship is having very honest conversations with the participants about what you can and can't do in the process.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, guys. I'm really sorry that we didn't have the chat box enabled. No, but I've just enabled it now. So hopefully we're going to get some questions coming in. Oh, here we go from Sarah M. She says, what are your opinions about co-designing research projects with researchers from the Global South from the outset? Chris, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think it massively depends on the kind of research that you're doing. I'm doing another postdoc next year. I'm starting a postdoc project, and then that is my attempt to co-design the project with young people in the Philippines and in Ethiopia, actually, Catherine, on youth activism. So I'll try to co-design it with them. I think it's good, but at the same time, I think it has a lot of challenges. To what extent can we be participatory in some of these spaces? To what extent can we actually ask them to shape our research when we know we have limitations in terms of what is required to us of our institutions or of our funders? That's all I can say on that topic. But
yeah, absolutely. Laura?
I'd say I think it's really important, and there's certain types of research. For example, if you're doing natural science research on, say, weather patterns that affect parts of the Global South, that it could be argued that it's not really relevant to, or I have heard people argue this, that it's not relevant to get communities to help shape the research. But actually, I don't agree with that. And I think certain sorts of research, like participatory methods, really lend themselves to this. But I do think that regardless of the kind of research we're doing, we should be thinking in the long term, who is this research for? Who's it going to impact? What are the benefits of this research that are not just for our own, frankly, personal careers? And thinking about the ways in which we can create spaces for other people's voices. So whether that's local communities, whether that's researchers who are from our host country institutions, whether that's hiring people into the project team as postdocs, particularly thinking about different hierarchies. And, if you are a senior researcher who is managing a larger project, thinking within your own team, when we are having voices from the Global South, are they at student level only, or are they an enumerator level only, or are they higher up and in decision-making levels? Thinking through within your own project and what's possible, how you can create space for voices, and do that right from the start.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before you start researching.
Great. So we've got a really interesting question here from Emmy that says that what can be done if a key power in the community is not interested to answer their interview? Do they have any advice on how they can go about finding the right answer in that situation?
Well,
go on, Chris.
Well, I guess it's difficult. Well, maybe perhaps you should go back to your question and maybe think about whether there's a right answer, really. I guess in certain open-ended interviews, it's difficult to have a right answer. But I think the other thing in that is that interviews as part of long-term ethnographic fieldwork really requires relationship building. So for me, the most honest interviews I've had were those that were much more informal, less directive, less structured. So I guess having that time or investing time to kind of build these relationships with the community members, especially those who are in power, for you to be able to understand their position, I think that's important for you to be able to get a very rich interview, I guess, and get their insights.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think sometimes you even get different answers if you to interview someone on day one of knowing you, and then to interview someone on, you know, further down the line. And that also happens in our relationships, in our personal lives, or, you know, back home, right? We will often say more when we have a more trusted relationship, and it takes people a while to suss you out. And sometimes it's difficult because we don't have long in the field. But I'd like to see that change, really. I'd like to see more time built into projects which are just you spending time in these places and not necessarily collecting data, but just sort of hanging out with people.
Yeah, that leads on really nicely to the next question, which is from Cara, which is basically asking for top tips to shift away from doing extractive research. So I think we've talked about, Chris, you mentioned designing policy briefs and working with local stakeholders, and Laura, you mentioned participatory methods. But then also, like you've just said, it needs an enabling environment, right? That allows the time and the finances to actually not be a parachute researcher and be less extractive. But do either of you have any other top tips for things that can be done to be less extractive?
I'd say as if I was going to give one top tip, it would be to actually ask people what they want, and to not assume that in advance, right? But like ask the people who you're with, what can I do to, you know, make this process involvement in this work as beneficial as possible to you? You know, is it, you know, be honest and frank, and you know, give people the respect to explain to them exactly what is possible. For example, I am not able to give people money, but there's other things perhaps I can do, and there's other ways I can support, and to have a frank conversation about, you know, what would help you and what would you like going forward, and to do that, and to let the people who you're working with lead. I think that's almost the thing we could do most to stop being extractive.
Yeah, what I was able to do is, for example, there are several things that I was able to do. Number one, I volunteered some time for the organization to write some funding proposals, and then whatever else that they needed that was supposed to be contracted from someone else. Instead of paying that person, I do it for free because I'm working with the organization. The other thing that I did was, and this is coming from an author called Charlene Swartz, she's saying that the ethics of reciprocity is about bringing back the knowledge production process to the participants, and that is being able to tell them your early analysis, and so that they can correct you if there's anything that you've misunderstood or misanalyzed. The other thing is I got really creative in terms of managing my resources. So before I went to Fieldwork, I applied for a research travel grant from BASE. It's the British Association for Comparative Education. And then part of that funding was actually it's a pot of money for the community, for the two organizations I was going to work with to spend. And it was up to them to spend that money. So it was not like, you know, I give you this money, but you need to spend it for a training program. No, you do what you want with this particular amount of money. Mm-hmm. And that only came up, I only told them towards the end of my field work. And I felt that was a good way of bringing back some of the economic benefit, as well as this kind of process of funding and grant writing, etc., to the community.
Yeah, great, thanks. So we've got 4 more questions, and we've got around 4 or 5 more minutes. So I'm just going to try and whip through them really quickly to try and see if we can have just collect some concerns, asking about the do no harm principle and how we can do no harm, especially considering the power imbalances. And can fieldwork ever really be ethical in its essence? And I think that is something we did talk about in the conversation. I think I may have cut a bit of it out. So I know that you both have thoughts on this.
That's a huge question. Thank you for asking it. I mean, answering it in a minute is going to be tricky, but I think yes, it's possible to do no harm. I think whether it's possible to have net benefit is more questionable. And I think there are voices that would say that people from the global north going to the global south and doing field work is inherently neocolonial and inherently extractive. And I actually personally like fairly sympathize with that view and think often it can be. But also, I think there's a lot you can do to mitigate that and to shift it from a potentially neocolonial dynamic to something that does no harm. And I think there are certain types of research where you can actually do good. And in my own experience of doing research with Ghana, the feedback has been great, actually. The feedback has been really just the process and how we've run it and how I've worked with my teams. People seem to think it's doing a good thing. And it's taken a while for us to get to that point, and there's been a lot of learning along the way, but I think it's possible.
Yeah.
That's great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Laura.
Yeah,
Chris, do you mind? Oh, yeah, just really quickly.
Go ahead.
No, if you want to say something, just really quickly.
Yeah, it's for me, what I would say is that the strength of long-term ethnographic fieldwork is that you gain a certain understanding of community practices that kind of tells you how to do things their way and to do things in a safe manner. So there is an opportunity to conduct ethical fieldwork, but it has to begin with an understanding of the community you're working with.
So Chris, I'm going to fire this question at you about how to navigate friendship in the field. And I think especially once you go back when you come home from the field, if you don't return and visit people after that intense period of living with them, that's a really difficult thing to navigate. I wonder how have you gone about dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I just made sure that I maintain connections with the people I researched with. So there's now Facebook, and in the Philippines use a lot of Facebook. So I did that a lot. Every time I go home, I would visit them. Even though I'm visiting my family, I would visit the community members. And then not only friendships, but also, I've written research proposals with them. I've written project grants and proposals with them. So some of these more kind of organizational kinds of relationships as well. And that kind of maintains our connection.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. And Laura, a question for you. With the talk about ethical toolkits, do you think there should be some liberty given to researchers to make ethical judgment calls? Are we confident that we are raising ethically responsible researchers?
The short answer is no, I'm not confident that we're currently raising ethically responsible researchers. It's a great time to plug the code of conduct that we've written. I think the reason that we're not is that this is not a core part of the training of researchers. It didn't exist in my undergraduate degree, it didn't exist in my master's. Most master's degrees, you have like a session on research ethics, but you won't have a session on fieldwork ethics. At Oxford, in the School of Geography, from next year, we're going to be including sessions on these topics. And I think that's what was required from the start. We need to be training researchers on how to think about this, and also being very conscious that researchers themselves come from all different backgrounds and have different personal ethical viewpoints, etc. So accommodating those differences, but also training people from early career stages to think through these things and think about how to apply their personal ethical lens to situations that may arise.
Absolutely. Last question for you, Laura. What are your thoughts on how to acknowledge the work of research assistants, for lack of a better term? I know this is something you've been thinking through a lot.
Again, I would say ask your teams what is most useful to them. So I think it's important to make sure that things like appropriate levels of pay are met, to make sure that they're having, they're working appropriate hours, they're reasonable working conditions, sick pay, holiday pay, these sorts of things that one would expect. To not ask them to take on risk that you would not be prepared to take on yourself. And aside from thinking about co-authorship, and I mean, there's a lot of constraints within that, thinking about other ways that they can have their professional voices heard. So can you help facilitate things like blogs? Are there other things in their careers? And I actually have direct conversations with my field team about, aside from, the day-to-day work of what you're doing, and I check in frequently with their well-being and their safety, etc. Have conversations a lot about how much I'm paying them. but what else can I do to support them through things like scholarship applications or other career opportunities, help with their CV? What are the skills that they would like to grow whilst they're working on these projects as well?
Great, lots of food for thought there. And then Chris, I'm just going to give you the final question, which is from John, which says, how do you best practice reflexivity when collecting data in a community that's familiar to you and where you may have interacted with most of the participants in the past?
Well, two things. Number one, try and spend time away from the field while you're doing in the process of doing the field work. So for example, I did an intense 3-month field work first, and then I went away for about 2 weeks away from the field to Norway for a conference. And then that actually gave me refreshed eyes when I went back. The other thing is that was helpful was when I was sending back some of my field notes to my supervisors, because then they were seeing things that I was not seeing. They were telling me, oh, this is interesting. And then I said, no, that's not really interesting to me because I've known that for a long time, but actually it is interesting when someone else looks at your data in, coming from a different lens. So those two things have been really useful to me.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I think we're going to leave it there. We're past the hour. We've run over because the conversation was so interesting. Thank you both so much for joining today. Yeah, it was really fascinating. And
thanks for having us, and thanks everyone for your questions, and great to chat to you, Chris and Catherine.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi guys,